So let's start. I want to make sure that everyone, again, everyone knows midterm is on March 21st. That's the week before spring break on the Tuesday. Okay, so what we will do is when we give the midterm, we will also then have the midterm available for people to do as the homework for that week. So we won't be assigning a different homework for that week, except maybe a couple of small problems or something. Okay, so the topic we want to continue is optimization, which we talked about momentum last time. I want to recap where we are. There were some questions that I got. I want to make sure that everyone understands. And then talk about adaptive methods, like ADAM, and kind of the idea behind them. And then we will go into a brief survey of architectures and problems. I'm going to cut this part of the class down to make up for time. And then we'll start into convnets. So I want to make sure we hit the main technical material in the course as opposed to survey stuff. Okay, so let's recall optimization basic properties. So recall plain vanilla gradient descent. What are the properties that you've learned? So hopefully discussion on the last 2 days has made this much, much clearer to everyone. Everyone's on the same page. Just make sure, and it's on the homework again for those people who didn't go to discussion. But you know that there's a limit on the learning rate which you've been using eta. Sometimes alpha is used in some parts of the community. That comes from the largest singular value. Right. Max. Right, in the nonlinear case, you can think of this as the local training features. So when you have this limit on the learning rate, the impact of it is that for the smaller singular values and for the directions that they represent, you have to use more iterations to converge. Okay? Now, I think one of the important things to keep in mind is the difference between the perspectives in an optimization course and the perspectives in a deep learning course. Right? So I thought it might be worthwhile kind of keeping these two perspectives a little bit different. In an optimization course that you've taken, the optimization objective is typically believed to be the thing that you care about. You actually care about, minimizing or maximizing your optimization objective. In the context of a deep learning course, we only kind of care about actually minimizing or maximizing whatever our optimization objective is. The optimization objective and the iterations, everything is merely instrumental to us in that our actual goal is to have good generalization performance to learn patterns correctly. So we would gladly trade off for a worse optimization if it gives us better generalization. Okay? So for us, in a deep learning class, the choice of the regularizer and things that are the properties of the learning algorithm matter, especially to the extent that they might change what we actually end up learning for the better or worse. Okay? That's why we're spending time in a deep learning class talking about optimizers. Because we need you to understand the basic idea behind them, but also to keep in mind always that they can change what you converge to. Okay? So this is really important to keep in mind. I think some people asked me questions that were a little bit kind of coming from this kind of philosophical distinction. Okay? So then there was a point I want to clarify. So when the eta is small, Small enough. What do I mean by small enough? I mean by small enough when, if you look at, on the unit circle, where the 1 minus 2 eta sigma, whatever we're using, right? Where these guys end up, right? Where the closed loop singular values, the closed loop eigenvalues of the iterates of gradient descent, where they end up. If they end up like this, right, all on this side of the unit circle, that's what I mean. When I say small enough, that's typically what I mean, okay? When you end up in this situation, right, this is the one here that comes from sigma 1, or alternatively, you want to think of it, sigma max, to remind yourself that the first one is the biggest. And, these are the ones coming from small ones. When eta is small enough, you have this behavior. Why? Because, at eta equals 0, everyone starts off here at 1, and then they all move back, depending on how big eta is, right? So when eta is small enough, what you see is we converge first in directions associated with sigma 1, then sigma 2, and so on. So this is what I meant about the when I talked about the question of, hey, you first learn the dominant direction in the training data, then the next one, and the next one kind of by the iterates of gradient descent. So people asked a question, which I thought was really good, saying that, well, when eta isn't small enough, right, does this story still hold? So the thing is, you already know the answer to that question. So let's look at, quote, medium values of eta. So for medium values of eta, what you get is, on the unit circle, some things have crossed over, perhaps. Okay, so now I'm going to say, okay, I'll put one more here, okay? By show of hands, I'm going to ask you all to vote for A, B, C, D, E, F, G. I've written these of them. Show of hands, which one converges first? Okay? So did everyone see the picture? Can people in the back see the circles? So see the unit circle and where the closed loop 1 minus 2 eta sigma end up? Can you guys see in the back? Okay, good. So now let's vote. Which one of these converges first? So over here, we said this one converges first. Sigma 1 converges, that direction converges, okay? How many people vote for A, which comes from sigma 1? B, sigma 2. C, sigma 3. Everybody, yes. D, sigma. Okay, good. Everyone gets it, right? So what matters is which one is the closest to the center, which one has the fastest convergence, right? That's what matters. So for medium learning rates, the order in which gradient descent will sort of fit these things can be different, right? So you can see how the learning rate, even when things converge, can, if you look at the entire learning system, which includes early stopping, the choice of learning rate can affect where you end up, right, in terms of what model you'll end up picking. Because suppose it was the case that the model that generalizes best was the one that fit C really well, and A and B kind of didn't really help that much in generalizing, right? In that case, this, with early stopping, isn't going to do as well as this will do with early stopping. Okay? So this is why, hyperparameters like learning rate and so on actually, this is kind of a picture in your mind to say why that actually might affect things. So this is also a really good time to, again, review something else. I mentioned it at the beginning, earlier in the class, but I want to make sure it's completely clear. You might be thinking that, wait, in my convex optimization class, or my optimization class, I was taught that if problems are nicely convex, that they will have a unique global minimum for my optimization problem, and so the choice of the optimizer is just a matter of details, right? We'll end up where we end up at the end. So how does that square with what I'm telling you? Okay, we're saying it matters. So it's a very good question to have, right? So again, the distinction is that first, in terms of the actual flow of how one does training and the use of deep neural nets, we are typically going to invoke checkpoints along the way and think about early stopping. So we're not just interested in where we converge to at the end, what the minimum is. That's like the one very important reason. There's also other reasons that are more surface level, less deep. That is, well, our problems aren't necessarily going to be convex. We might not have a unique global minimum in that case. That's kind of also true, but I think philosophically less important than the first one. But there's one more thing too, which is that even when problems are, seemingly convex and nice, you also have the possibility of having your optimization problem having infinitely many global optima. Okay? And so first, can anyone give me the simplest possible example of a problem that has all the beautiful, nice convexity type pictures that you would expect? Like it's the kind of problem you're like, yeah, that's like the poster child for a nice optimization problem, but it has infinitely many global optima. You understand the question? So it's like, I'm not asking in a very technical way, because you say, wait, no, the theorem says if something is strictly convex, yes, it's true. I'm not asking you to deny the theorem, right? Yes, it's true, right? I'll have a unique. But I'm saying a problem that looks very nice, but has infinitely many global optima. Anything that's flat. Okay, yes. So that's a very good, somewhat trivial example, but spiritually correct, which is the problem optimize 0 times the parameter vector minus x squared, or minus y squared. Okay, yes, because your parameters don't matter. Infinitely many global optima, namely anything. Okay, good. That's actually a good answer, but let's make it more realistic. Something that'll actually, can show up where you don't have 0 necessarily. Yeah. Okay, so the picture that was asked was asked is to think of a third dimension. So let's think of a parabola, but let me make it into a big a skateboarder playground, right? So it's like a long pipe. Okay, that's what you're thinking of, an optimization like that. Good. Can anyone give me a mathematical representation that would have this as the loss surface? It's good to be able to go back and forth. I just want to make sure that everyone has these intuitions exercised. So, okay, I'm gonna don't censor yourself if you know the answer. Give me a something mathematically, some kind of optimization problem whose loss surface will look like this. Yeah.
Minimized over y squared.
Yeah. x1, x2. Maybe I'll just use more deep learning-y language. w1, w2. Yeah, right? Does everyone see that? You don't care about the other parameter. Now, this seems very special, but actually let's make it completely not special, right? These pictures. where this is a wide matrix. Okay? So it's good to have this intuition. If A is a wide matrix, you have more unknowns than equations. You can fit everything with room to spare. Right? You can fit everything with room to spare. It means you can have a global minimum, namely something which achieves 0, can't get better than 0, and there's infinitely many of them. Okay? So you might say, why am I talking about this, what might seem like from optimization point of view, a weird corner case, like, oh, why do you need positive definiteness and not positive semi-definiteness? In an optimization course, it would be something like that. It's like, it feels like, some weird technicality, right? But here, this really matters because many modern deep learning systems will operate in a regime where you have gobs and gobs and gobs of parameters. So many parameters, and you have fewer training points than you have parameters. So if you have fewer training points than you have parameters, you're in something that locally always looks like this. And so that thing will tend to have infinitely many global optima. And once you have infinitely many global optima, there's this question, right, that arises, which is your algorithm, which one does it go to, even if it converges? It's not just a question of the path, right, as it would be for early stopping. Once there's infinitely many global optima, it could go to any one of them. And so it matters a lot for generalization which one it goes to. Because although you have a small number of training points, you actually want to work on a whole bunch of points you haven't seen yet, right? So, they might behave, all of them might behave the same on the training points, but differently on other points. Okay? So this, I want to make sure that, I know I'm spending a little bit of time on this, but it's really important to keep the perspective in mind, right? That why do deep learning classes talk about optimization? This is why. Okay? So, speaking of this, if you just, we know that if you do vanilla gradient descent on a problem like this, we actually know where you converge to, okay? Which is, if you start at 0, suppose I initialize my weights at 0 for this problem. If I initialize at 0, the only W's I'll ever get, we talked about this before when we talked about the actual iterates of gradient descent for ridge or for gradient descent, the only iterates of W I'm ever going to get are going to be linear combinations of data points, right? Which means you're in exactly the same subspace that guarantees that you'll get the min-norm solution. So it's important to remember that by itself, vanilla gradient descent will tend to, and this is a very robust thing, it will tend to go to the min-norm solution. Where by min-norm we mean it's lazy. Wherever you start, it'll try to go to the closest place that'll get it to minimizing the loss. Okay? Where close is in this local sense, right? Remember, everything here is in terms of the local features. Right? If it can get there locally, it'll go there. Okay, good. Is all this clear to people? Okay, so now you understand, like, why do we care about what's going on here? So now, we talked last time about SGD with momentum, which a gradient descent with momentum. Okay, so actually, this is a good point. To comment on one thing, which is we often talk about vanilla gradient descent, but what we use in practice is always stochastic gradient descent. And the two are not the same. Okay? They're not the same. So let's take a brief moment to understand the difference. Okay? So when you're doing stochastic gradient descent, what you expect to see is that when you do the gradient step, you're going to get some noise that comes from the randomness of which batch you chose. So the general feeling is that if there is still a dominant singular value locally, that probably, again, this is a hope, because it doesn't have to be this way, the dominant singular value is probably something which will be well represented in many, many, many data points. So your batch will probably have it, and you'll probably still get a pull in that direction, typically. And so for this reason, you believe that even when you do SGD, that kind of in spirit, these findings will still hold, except you're going to get a little bit of shaking. Everything will shake more, right? So it'll be some noise that makes it shake. It's actually a really interesting thing, and I have a homework problem I could give on this, but I don't know if I will. If you do SGD so first something you should be able to prove, right? If you do SGD and you're in this situation here, do you go to the min-norm solution if you converge? Okay, so this is the Did everyone understand the question? The question is, you're not going to do gradient descent, so you're not going to look at the entire A matrix at once. You're just going to take a subset of rows randomly every time, and you're going to take an SGD step. So I'm going to say, suppose you actually converge. I'm going to make that, let's assume that we converge. Okay, so SGD, suppose I say SGD converges on this problem. And the question is, will you converge, having started at 0, will you converge to the min-norm solution? Everyone understand the question? Okay, so now let's see what you guys think. Let's first take an initial poll. How many people think, yes, you will converge to the min-norm solution? Raise your hand. Few people. Okay. How many people think, no, you won't converge to the min-norm solution? Raise your hand. Okay. A few other people, a few more people. How many people are like, I'm not sure, and I didn't just say I'm not sure by this, how high I raised my hand. It's really nice. It's a deep learning class. Good to have confidences, right? Sort of. No, definitely, you know? Like, so good for you. But how many people are like, I really am not sure at all? Okay, so it's a good mix. Okay, so let's see. Could someone advocate for why they think that if this thing converges, it will converge to the min-norm solution? You start at 0, you're doing SGD, taking random rows at a time. Who wants to advocate for that? Yeah? Yeah. So everyone heard that? The argument was you're still moving within the subspace of data points. Right? And if you remember, when you proved that the appropriate Moore-Penrose pseudo-inverse formula holds for the min-norm solution, you said that once you're constrained to moving within that subspace, there's a unique optimum point that fits the data points. Okay? So, in fact, that argument carries the day. If SGD were to converge on this problem, right, it would have no choice to converge except to the min-norm solution. Why is that? Okay? Because the reason is anywhere else that's not a solution would still shake. Right? Because you draw that point randomly, it wouldn't fit, there would be a stochastic gradient, and you would move. And the point of convergence is that you stop moving, or asymptotically stop moving. So indeed, that's correct. So SGD, so this is I bring this up because this is one of the reasons we believe generally that SGD will tend to inherit the properties of gradient descent, except some amount of shaking around to do that. It's actually a very interesting and completely non-trivial fact that not only will SGD converge in these cases, but you can get SGD to converge in these cases with a constant step size. You don't even need the step size to go down. Typically for SGD, in your optimization classes, you learned you need the step size to drop. Why? Because things are shaking, you need to do more averaging. But the point is, here, if it converges, it stops shaking, which means it can converge even with a constant step size. So just a comment on that. Okay, so now we're going to talk about gradient descent with momentum, like we talked about it last time. And what gradient descent with momentum says is that we would like to basically be able to use a larger learning rate. And to use a larger learning rate, so it's really important to keep that in mind. That's the goal. The goal is to converge faster. So these are called acceleration methods, right? And from a traditional optimization perspective, the goal is to converge to the same place, the unique global optimum, just to do it faster. So you want to go faster. Eta. And to do that, we want to basically avoid the problem that you saw in the discussion, which is this thing, as it approaches this side, is going to start swinging quite violently up and down, right? And we want to dampen those oscillations. So the idea is low-pass filter, the gradient, and you do that. So now here, it's good to do a couple of things to comment in case people haven't seen this before. It's also relevant. That's like a good way to review something. A comment on low pass filtering and averaging. So how do you smooth out the shaking or ups and downs in something? Very intuitively, you can average, right? You might just believe that by yourself. Averaging is good for removing variation. You can also think about an alternative picture, sort of circuits picture, which is the simplest low-pass filter. Looks like this, right? And if this input voltage shakes, the capacitor will help, achieve averaging, and the output voltage won't shake as much, right? That's kind of a circuits picture. Now, what connects these two pictures? What connects these two pictures is that this is like a continuous time differential equation, right? And the solution of linear continuous time differential equations involves integrals that look like this. Right, where this is called the convolution integral. Where this is the input, function of time, and this is the alternatively called impulse response or kernel, depending on the community. And it's important to remember that all this integral is a fancy generalized average, right? Because what's an average? Add a bunch of things up together with some weights, right? That's an average. What is this doing? What's an integral? It's a limit of Riemann sums. What's that? Sums, right? So it's adding up a bunch of these with some weights. Okay, so it's like a fancy average. All convolutions are fancy averages. So for these kinds of systems, again, for those who remember, for a first order differential equation, the h of tau looks like this. Exponential. And what that means is it's a move. This thing is like the relevant convolutional integral is like a moving average that most heavily weights the present and weights the past in a decaying way. So that's the kind of average this represents. So when you think of this kind of a thing, the way it dampens out oscillations is that it weighs whatever's going in this kind of exponentially weighted way. Okay? So this should be review for people. Probably you've seen the convolution integral in some course in when you talk about the response of differential equations to linear differential equations to systems. Some of you in physics context might have seen this in the context of Green's functions and the like. All related things, okay? So this is like a differential equation point of view. Like I draw a circuit for the differential equation. What's the discrete time counterpart of this? Right? You basically take a sum. Oops, tau. And, you know, that's what you do. You just do everything with a sum. So I could put an h here, but let me just capture something that looks like this. For the specific discrete time counterpart of this, you get something that looks like this. Okay? So you notice this is just a geometric that dies down. And I just chose a parameterization that made it an actual averaging, right? So it integrates to 1 or sums up to 1, right? So it's like an average. So you have this kind of infinite response that corresponds to this thing. But the nice thing is this solution corresponds to the following difference equation. I guess I used brackets, so I'll put a bracket for you. Okay, so this is where, so, you know, and when I talked about it last time, I jumped immediately to this kind of equation. I want to show you, like, where would that come from, right? It's the natural discrete time counterpart of a first order differential equation, right? And it achieves smoothing. So this A is going to be a smoothed version of the input U, whatever you stick into it. Where the smoothing is going to happen this way. If you want to make it more smooth, right? For the exponential, you want to make it decay slower, right? Because if the exponential decays slower, you're getting more weight to more terms in the past. And so here, decaying slower is making beta closer to 0. Right, so just to see the connection. Any questions on this kind of comment on how, you know, where this particular formula we did last time, where it came from? Any questions on how this works? Why it works, what it's connected to, and so on. So what's nice about it, again, remember, from the perspective of deep learning in practice, you care about actual resource limitations on your machines, right? There's like stuff has to stay in appropriate memory. You have to be able to keep your parameters and store them. If you're going to be doing updates of things, everything you need to do the updates has to stay in memory. Okay? So what's really nice about this is that if you had to say, I would like to average the last 3 gradients, and that's the way I'm going to do the averaging. I'll average the last 3 things. How many things do you have to keep in memory? You know, at least 3, maybe 2, right, if you're like tricky, right? You do this, you keep one thing in memory, the state. So you have your actual gradient and one more. You keep actual parameters, and one more thing is this running average. What's nice about this running average is if you say, I don't want 3, I want more smoothing, I want to do 10, you just change beta. Now, of course, this is not the same as averaging the last 3 or last 4, but in spirit it is, right? And all we care about is to appropriately dampen things, right? We don't care about let's average the last 5. Like, it doesn't matter to us. We just want the effect of smoothing of averaging the last 5. And this will also give us that effect. So in deep learning, we always like to choose architectures and parameterization and ways of doing things that will, with a little bit of an eye towards the implementation, to make sure that we're not like blowing our memory budget because of some fancy thing that we're doing. So keep it simple, right? Okay? So using this in the context of momentum, the update we actually do for gradient descent or SGD with momentum is we'll still keep the update to the parameters just as it was before, with one exception. Instead of using the gradient, we're going to use our smooth gradient. To compute our smooth gradient, as I mentioned before, we just use that formula. Whatever our gradient of the loss is that we want to do, evaluated at the parameterization that we have last time. Okay? Is momentum clear in terms of like how it works? Yeah. Oh, this connection? Yeah. So, okay. This kind of thing, right? This kind of thing, so it goes this way. For integrals, this kind of thing solves linear differential equations with inputs. Right? So you can go in spirit back and forth between this kind of integral and a differential equation. Right? Look at the solution. So it's like I can give you equations or I can give you the answer. Same information in both. Is that part clear? Okay. So same way, this thing solves a recurrence relation. A first order, in particular, a first order discrete time recurrence relation. Namely, this one. So instead of doing this, which is crazy because you have to do infinite sums, right? You just do this and keep going. So it's this realization that if I want to do this, I can also do this. The output. So this whole thing is
Would there be a difference between like in the omega wt plus 1 equals to wt minus eta a plus 1 in the equation? Would there be a difference if we take at instead of at plus 1?
Good question. Excellent question. The question is, why did I write at plus 1 here? Right? Is the spirit of the question you asked. Why didn't I write at? It's kind of weird to mix t and t plus 1s in one equation. Usually you have t plus 1 on this side and everything here is on t. So first is like you can just substitute this in and then everything will be in terms of t. So that part's clear? So now why did I put t plus 1 here? The reason is the step I take, I want to depend on the gradient at where I was, not where I was 2 times ago. But this actually leads to a very interesting and kind of twisty little point that I want to get to. Okay, and you probably kind of brought me right to it. So, where should we evaluate the gradient? We have a choice of where to evaluate the gradient. Right? Standard thing is, well, let's evaluate the gradient where my parameters are right now. Okay? Now, one of the interesting things that one can do in the context of momentum is you say, look, wait a minute. If I did traditional gradient descent, right, I'd say, look, I'm here right now. What does my local neighborhood look like? Let me look at the gradient, and then let me move. So for gradient descent, it's clear that you should look at the gradient where you are right now. Okay? But here, you think, wait a minute. I want to look at the gradient in the local neighborhood of where, to know how to steer. The goal of the gradient is to steer. Okay? And so, in the context of momentum, I'm already moving. And I already know a little bit about where I'm going to end up because of this term. So the question is, should I evaluate the gradient where I am now? or where I know I'm going to end up and then steer from there. You see? Subtly different. Okay? If you're moving, right, generally in a control setting, if you're moving, you want to know if it's already inevitable that you'll end up here. You want to know, and all you can do is going to choose what happens after you get there. You want the best information there, not here. Very subtle. It's a small thing. Okay? So there is a variant of SGD and gradient descent momentum in which we change this part. And this is sometimes called the Nesterov variant. So alternatively, instead of evaluating the gradient at WT, you evaluate it at the part where you know you're going to end up. You already committed to by your algorithm. So you see, like, next time you're going to move minus eta times, eta, with the eta, right? You're going to move minus eta times AT plus 1. This part is already determined. That's not going to change. So evaluate the gradient there. Get a little bit better local view of what's going on. So, use this instead. So if you look, for example, in PyTorch, there's a flag that you can set that will make it do this one versus this one. And so there's theoretical reasons why in certain settings this is provably, you can prove it's better. Practically speaking, it makes very little difference in most settings, which one you do in the context of using SGD, but you should know it's there. Yeah?
Is there any reason why, if I remember correctly, in the code there was like beta 1 and beta 2 instead of just one beta?
Yeah, great question. So I've given you a treatment of momentum that I believe is easier to understand where it's coming from. In the code, they actually mix, in PyTorch standard implementation, they mix the role of eta and beta to be like beta 1, beta 2, and so on. So let's think what happens, right? The reason, remember I said we did this so that we would have an average meaning an average? So this is like a normalization we did to have it be this way. What governs the kind of amount of smoothing is actually this thing. This is telling you how far you go back in the past. This is like a normalization term to make the average be whatever it is. But remember, A only enters into what you care about after being multiplied by eta. So it already has a scaling that gets hits by. So you don't need this thing to be normalized in the way that I did here. In terms of interpretation, it makes it easier to understand. But in terms of having the same expressive power, it doesn't matter, right? I can have two different things here and here. However, if you do that, if you put something here different than 1 minus beta, then effectively what you're doing is changing the learning rate. And this confuses a lot of people. That's why I did this. Why PyTorch does it that way is historical. I have no idea. Like, there's some historical reason. Some paper had it be a separate parameter, and they just stuck to that way of doing it. I think this is a lot easier to understand. Yeah.
If we use the original gradients, what would happen is that we wouldn't converge fast enough, right? Like, our goal is to go fast, like get the learning rate faster. So if we use that gradient, what would happen?
Yeah, so what happens if you use this gradient? So again, in the homework, we have you grind out, what happens. So just, I'll answer your question about what happens, but in reference to the homework, right? In the homework, you're grinding this one out for analysis purposes. And when you analyze this thing, you see first that, look, although everything here is vectors, in the context of a problem like this, you can just go to SVD coordinates from the perspective of the observer, and everything will again decouple. Right? All the different SVD directions will decouple, and you'll get a bunch of 2x2 problems for every different dimension. And then you have to deal with the eigenvalue structure of the resulting 2x2. Okay? Notice that that entire global story doesn't change if you use this or this. Like, it doesn't matter. You just get a different 2x2 if you did that. So basically, if you do this, you can prove theoretically that with the appropriate choice of beta and the learning rate, you can in general do better in terms of convergence than if you do this. Right? So in the homework we say, hey, but it's kind of involved, right? Like you grind it out, you get like these quadratics, there's like some limit, and you can kind of see empirically what happens, and you can see that acceleration that this gives you. It's just, we could have added a part, we say now repeat for this, right? It would have just changed the equations a little bit. There would still be some grungy thing, you'd still have to grind it out, and you'd see that, okay, can we make it a little faster? It won't make it instant, because you still have the problem that you can still diverge. So, does that answer your question? Okay. In general, you want to use small enough step size so that the local things are changing slowly. For general nonlinear problems, right? Now, let's come back. Just as in vanilla gradient descent, now what happens is that the resulting eigenvalues that govern what's happening is you get a pair of eigenvalues for every one of these things instead of one eigenvalue. Why? Because you've doubled your state dimension. Before, all you had was your weights. Now you have the weights and average gradients, two things you're tracking. So you have twice as many eigenvalues, and so each of these will split into two things, and then your convergence is going to be dominated by which ones are closer, which ones are further, and the same kind of story will occur, right? Depending on the learning rate, depending on what the momentum term is, you will get different modes converging fastest. Okay, so that's, again, why the choice of momentum and the choice of learning rate, momentum parameter and learning rate parameter, these are hyperparameters that can affect how the generalization behavior is. Especially in the context of early stopping. Okay, so that's hopefully makes this clear. I wanted to draw, before I move on to adaptive methods, I wanted to draw a little circuit analogy for what happens when you're with small learning rate. Beta is small enough. Okay, so comment. If you look in the deep learning literature, you will often, from people trying to understand what's happening in deep learning, one of the tools that they will use is they will say, instead of thinking about the discrete time behavior of the iterates of gradient descent or stochastic gradient descent, let me make the assumption for purposes of understanding that we actually have a continuous time flow. The reason is that our tools and our concepts for understanding differential equations are more mature and better developed than our tools and concepts for understanding discrete time iterations. In part because discrete time iterations in the nonlinear context can have all kinds of pathological behavior that nice continuous time differential equation flows will not. So people in papers will try to use differential equation flows. What I'm going to draw right now is kind of the same eta is small enough spirit, and I'm going to express the differential equations that come out of this thing using a physical analogy of a circuit, so you can kind of see what's happening. So simple circuit analogy of gradient descent. So gradient descent first looks like this, like a toy. Again, for those who understand these things, this can be helpful. For those who do not, it's fine. Don't worry about it. Okay, so what is this? This is a simple circuit that has an inductor, a current source, and a resistor. And the way you think about training is that when training starts, this current source turns on. Okay. This is IS. What does this represent? IS represents the training data in the mode, the relevant mode of so think about the singular value structure. Let's think of each of those different singular values as corresponding to a mode, like a physical mode of a system. And the training data is exciting that mode when you start training. That excitement is this current. That's what it's modeling. The L, the gradient, the inductor represents what the parameters learn. So at convergence, everything about all this current is accounted for in this inductor. The parameters perfectly fit the excitement that the training is doing. You fit, okay? However, when you start off, there's no current through here. And so you have a residual. The current that's coming out of here, coming through here, is not the current that's going here. That residual passes through this resistor, generating a voltage here, which is the gradient. That gradient moves the current here and makes it change. So this is gradient descent expressed as a RL circuit. Okay, and so what you get is the convergence of this current. This reflects, the current through here reflects the parameter that's being learned. Okay? So the interesting thing here is that in the continuous time setting, you could just, if you want to make it converge faster, you just increase this, make the voltage bigger, and make this current converge faster. That would correspond to increasing the learning rate by a lot. Which is why in continuous time gradient flows, there's no limit on how big the learning rate is because the learning rate is assumed to be infinitesimal. And so the infinitesimal can be as big as it wants. It's still infinitesimal. So you never feel the discrete time. So this is gradient descent. So what's gradient descent with momentum? It's the same picture because you still have the excitation that's coming from the training data. You still have the parameters that you need to learn. You still have a gradient that's going to be generated by having a residual go somewhere, but you're going to dampen the voltage by a momentum term, and that's a capacitor you add to it. So with momentum, the averaging of the gradient that happens is captured by another state variable, another thing that holds state. In this physical analogy, this state represented by this element is the parameters. This state is the average. And again, if you look at this, if you have physical feeling for this, I could draw, there's a mechanical counterpart too. This is like an electrical counterpart. There's a mechanical counterpart of the same thing. What happens is this thing will, initially, it will go here. There's not current flowing through here, but it will just get sunk here first. And the voltage will start going up. That corresponds to what? If you initialize this at 0, initially this gradient is just going here. It's not really moving this very much because this is ramping up. But once this thing ramps up, it sees the average gradient, it smooths the gradient, and now you get convergence. But now, for this case, you know that there's many different settings. You could get convergence that looks like it did before. You could also get convergence that looks like this. Oscillating modes, And the same thing applies to the understanding of what happens for gradient descent momentum, even in discrete time. Of course, in the context of continuous time analogies, which are going to be in the infinitesimal learning rate case, you will never have instability. There can't be any instability in the system because everything is passive, right? But, you know, it just still helps you understand why there'll be oscillations and why there's a consideration of how much dampening you have and so on. This helps some people understand. On the lecture ed post, I posted a link to a blog, which I think has a really nice visualizations of like some of this story of the continuous time kind of picture and so on. So that can help you understand momentum. Okay, any questions on momentum before I talk about adaptive methods? Again, here, if this helps you understand, great. If this does not help you understand, that's fine too. You can just think of it in terms of differential equations or in terms of recurrence relations and eigenvalues. It's all good. Okay, so with that, I'm going to, no questions? Okay. I'm going to now talk about adaptive methods. There's actually a long history of adaptive methods. I could talk about more of them, but I'm not going to. I'm just going to talk about the one that everyone will use, which is called ADAM. But if you want to know some of the history of what's going on, I mentioned it before. There's an entire approach to thinking about learning problems that is coming from an area called online optimization, right? It's sometimes called online optimization, sometimes called online learning. And that has to do with how do you think about doing learning problems where you don't see all the data all at once, you just see it bit by bit by bit. It's quite beautiful, it's quite fun. You have lots of interesting theorems and lots of interesting perspectives that kind of way of looking at the world connects to. But one of the interesting things about online learning is the spirit that says, as the game continues, you learn what game you're playing. Like, you don't know what situation you're actually facing because it's being unfurled to you bit by bit by bit. And so in that context, the idea of adaptation is really important, right? Because you need to adapt to the situation you find yourself in that context. It's like fundamental to that context. And so a lot of the analysis and ways of thinking about adaptive algorithms kind of, you can intellectually root in that literature. And so there's a whole story behind Adam building up pieces that comes from that literature that I'm just going to completely ignore. And I'm just going to talk about it kind of more directly. If you go back and read the original papers about Adam, they'll reference earlier methods like AdaGrad and RMS prop and things like this, which if you read those papers, you will see the connections to online learning kind of overt in terms of what's happening. Here, I'm just going to kind of short circuit all that and talk about how these things work from a kind of basic point of view. So with that kind of commentary out of the way, the idea behind adaptive methods is to say, wait, even after we did things like momentum, we're still stuck with the fact that there is this huge dynamic range, potentially, between the singular values. And so the big ones are going to limit how big we can make the learning rate and what our averaging terms are like in momentum. And then we have to live with it for the small ones. Does everyone see that kind of core tension that we've had from the beginning for gradient descent? Even these acceleration methods, you're stuck with one learning rate. And so the idea in adaptive methods is, can we have different etas for different modes? Right? Because if we could do that, we could make everything converge super, fast. Everyone understand the intuition? Like, why do I have to have one learning rate? Let me have lots. Okay, now, unfortunately, there's a huge underlying problem, which is that when we talk about thinking from the SVD perspective and so on, we're taking the perspective of an external observer that has access to the whole training data all at once and can kind of look and knows what directions to look at. And the algorithm itself never sees it, right? An algorithm that's running doesn't know what the modes are. It just knows, okay, I have this data. I have this batch of data. It doesn't know what the relevant directions are. So at first glance, you might think, okay, that's a pretty fatal flaw, right? How am I supposed to have adaptive different learning rates for the different modes if I can't even know where the modes are? So again, the deep learning spirit comes into play, which is you look where the light is. And so you say, well, I don't know what the different modes are, but I do know different parameters. So let me use a different learning rate for each of the different parameters. Does everyone see the thing? Like, I can definitely see that this is the first weight, and this is the second weight, and this is the third weight. Now, it might be that actually there's an underlying direction, which is 3 times the first minus 2 times the second plus 0.02 times the third. And that's the relevant direction I should be thinking about. I can't see that, but I can definitely see this is one thing, and this is something different, and this is something different. So let me just use, so the drunk light bulb idea, drunk lamp post principle, says use different etas for different weights, not modes, because that's what you can see. So how do you do this? The idea is, okay, what do you want to do? You want to do, the idea then becomes, what do I want to achieve by using different learning rates? What I want to achieve is, where the gradients are small, I want to move with bigger steps, because it's safe to do so. The gradients are small. Where the gradients are very large, I want to be more conservative in the step size I take. Okay, so idea. Gradients are small. So what you need to do is you need to know when are gradients small and when are they big, right? Like most basic thing. Your idea is to use them bigger eta when gradients are small, so you need to track size somehow. So what do? So again, the algorithm is as follows. You will add another state variable. So we're going to average the gradients, and we're also going to keep track of size. Okay, so instead of just having the parameters, we'll have 2 more things. The average gradient and something which tracks size. So algorithmically, we'll still have at plus 1 equaling 1 minus beta at plus beta gradient evaluated at wt. And we're going to track the average size. So I'll write vt plus 1 equals, I'll do the same averaging trick, right? Because I want to track how big the sizes are And I want my sizes to be something that's reasonably stable. Right? Because you could always say, how big is the gradient? Well, I know how big it is. I just look how big it is. It's 7. It's 0.2. But that's not really what you want. Right? You want to know, is this particular gradient like always kind of small? Versus, is this particular gradient always kind of big? That's where I want to set my step size. Because if I just used the actual current size of the gradient, I would just move by a constant amount in every direction. And I don't necessarily want that. Right? I want to be able to, for example, converge. Right? If I do that, I will never converge. Does everyone see that? Like I need some kind of thing that'll make me kind of smooth this out a bit, the size. So to smooth the size out, I do the same trick. But now you got to pick something that you track. And there's many things you could track. You could track the absolute value of the gradient. But what people do is they just use the squares, add together the squares. So I just look at the gradient with respect to the first parameter, the derivative with respect to the first parameter of the loss. Again, evaluated at WT. And I just square it. I do the same thing all the way to whatever the biggest parameter is I have. The last parameter I have is. Okay, so this is like the square gradient, the element-wise squared gradient. Why do I do this? It's cheap to compute. Right? And it's kind of like tracking the standard deviation, if you want. Like, or the variance. I'm just tracking the variance. Having done this, this is telling me how big things are. This is telling me what my average gradient is. I have to combine it together into actually taking a step, an adaptive step. So once you think of it this way, the adaptive step rule practically writes itself. And I'm going to describe it to you in like a simple form first. But let's just look at the ith component. They want to have different steps in different directions, right? So look at the ith component. So the ith component of the updated weight is going to be the previous weight in the ith component. I'm going to do minus some learnable parameter eta. And then I'm going to want to do at plus 1 in the ith component, which is what the average gradient is. But now I want something here that will make this thing get bigger when the sizes are small and smaller when sizes are big. Okay? So how do I do that? Well, this thing is tracking the average square, basically. So I want to basically look at the square root of vt plus 1 I in spirit. And I want to take a reciprocal. Okay? That way, I'm like normalizing by the average size. Standard deviation, basically, right? But you look at this, and every time you have a division, you should always be nervous. And so the first thing you do is you say, okay, I'm just going to add some little fudge factor, epsilon here, so that I don't divide and make this thing giant. In case these gradients are very small, like let it converge in final endgame to just have it like sit somewhere, okay? And so this is, so you can think of this as to prevent things from going crazy. You have this plus epsilon. This is normalizing to the average size of the gradients, and this is the typical step size. This is the heart of Atom. Now there's a few additional considerations that are there that I want to talk about. So again, if I wrote out all of Atom for you, if you look at the code, you might look at the code and go, this is very confusing, there's lots of stuff going on. But if you understand this is the heart of what's happening, then you can understand the code kind of iteratively in terms of what it's doing. Like first level of understanding, and then like the next level. Before I do anything more, is this clear? How this works in terms of as an algorithm? Okay, so now we track 3 things. Important to know. So our memory has increased. You have to track the weights, the average gradients, and the average sizes. 3 things have to be tracked. But fortunately, only 3 things. So a 3x increase in your memory requirements for running Atom over running gradient descent. Sometimes this matters. Because this is memory that's not available, for example, for batches. Okay, so here I want to make the first comment is, what about these betas? Okay, like what do we have to think about the betas? So comment. The beta prime that's averaging the sizes has to be more averaging than the average you keep of the gradients themselves. Because what you want is something that reflects the average size of the gradients on a bigger time scale than the actual averaging that determines the average gradient itself. Otherwise, you'll have too much variability coming from this. You want this to be like something that's more steady. Because you want the action of where you move to be largely determined by the gradient, or the smooth gradient. Okay, so beta prime is typically smaller than beta, so V is more smoothed. So this is the consideration in Atom. Next thing is another level of detail that I don't even want to write all the details out for. Once you've committed to this, okay, that the beta prime is going to be smaller, then you have an issue which already existed in gradient descent momentum, but kind of comes to a head here, which is, if this is a very small number, this thing has to be initialized somewhere, okay? And this thing is being initialized in some way, so this thing is actually going to be ramping up to the average size very slowly. So by itself, like in the context of just gradient descent momentum, if this is ramping up, right, as it is here, it's like not a big problem, right? If this is ramping up, it just means you're moving slowly at the beginning. Fine, you can do things to accelerate that, but it's okay. Does everyone see that? Like, moving slowly won't cause bad things to happen. It'll just slow you down. You'll get the acceleration later after this is converged. And make sure, does everyone understand that? Okay. Here, however, if the V's are very small, bad things are happening. Okay? Because this is too big. Like, so, danger, right? Normalization of A appropriately during slow startup is, yeah, okay, you can do it, you cannot do it, it's okay. Normalization of this during slow startup is essential. Okay? So what do? You basically just put this on the right local scale. Like, you know how fast this is converging, you know how big it can get, and you can just like knock this guy up in such a way that it's on the right scale, so this thing doesn't become too giant. So you make V bigger to prevent 1 over square root V from becoming too small for the purposes of this calculation. So if you look at the formula in PyTorch, you will see something which is basically that. So it's looking at you know exactly how this geometric sum is converging. So you can just use the finite geometric sum part to normalize this appropriately. Okay? That's the other part of Atom. Deal. Okay, it's the natural thing to do. It's like nothing, once you realize the scale, you know how to fix it, and it's done. That's Adam. So Adam is believed by many people today, I think reasonably, to be, if you don't know what optimizer to use, and there isn't a previous paper that argued for a different one, you should use Adam as the good default general starting optimizer. Practically, people have found that it tends to work quite well in practice. In large part because it buys you, it gets convergence to be significantly faster in many cases, and tends not to be that sensitive to the choice of the learning rate that you make. Yeah.
Why do we still need the learning rate? Okay.
Oh, why do you still need the learning rate? Because, yeah, it kind of does, but you still need to have like some overall scale of the learning rate to have it adapt. It's the way it's set up, right? You have to, okay. If you want to, okay, why do you need a learning rate? How do you answer this question? One way in many engineering or science contexts is to simply say, let me look at units. Okay? What's happening is that this thing has kind of gradient units. Okay? It has units of like stuff on parameters. But this has units of squared that. Okay? Do you see that? This has squared units. This has whatever units are on gradients. Gradient units, can be translated by some connection to applying to parameters. But especially when you divide by this, you've now killed the units. Do you see that? Like there's whatever units were here, square root v has the same units, and now there's no units. Okay? But this has units in spirit, right? It's a kind of thing. So you better translate. You know what I'm saying? Like it's like this is a very generic kind of science engineering intuition that you probably all learned in your chemistry class or something, right? Like way back, but you just keep it in mind. It's always there, right? So you kind of just from that perspective, something needs to kind of translate. You need to set the right scale. So there's still this kind of at a spirit level. But you expect it to be less important because this thing will try to, help you out in terms of getting things to the right scale. So more comments on Adam. So people actually found, however, that in many controlled, careful experiments, that they would see settings where SGD would actually converge to something, SGD with momentum, would converge to something that had better generalization performance than Adam did. So Adam would converge faster, but in many cases, SGD would work better. So it's not like you always can say, just use Adam. So to understand why, you have to see that this drunk lamppost principle that we applied, right? The drunk near the lamppost. Like, you should have felt there that was risky, right? We know what matters is the actual modes. But we're just looking at different etas effectively for different weights. So we're wedded to a particular coordinate system in this adaptation. And the possible match or mismatch between this coordinate system that we're wedded to and what you want to have happen can cause good or bad things to happen. So you might actually lose some of the implicit regularization that gradient descent originally was giving you. Because we might be converging too fast in junk directions. Right? And the junk directions had small gradients, so gradient descent was like, yeah, I'm not going to do anything, and Adam is helpfully gaining them up for you. Right? So you have to be aware the inductive bias of Adam and what it does can make a difference to what's going on. In particular, in the context of transformer architectures, there is a variant of, so notice everything here I've always talked about in the context of straight up gradient descent, right? And I've taken the gradients with respect to the loss. Remember we talked about how ridge regularization can also be interpreted as weight decay, where I add a term here that kind of decays this weight. Now you might think, okay, fine, but I could have just folded that into the gradient by putting it into the loss. You see that? Like I can just, it didn't matter for a gradient descent. But here, that for sure matters. Because if I just do weight decay here, that's very different than having it show up inside these losses and get normalized in some goofy way. And so there's a variant of Adam called Adam W that is often used in the context of transformers. It gives better inductive bias and many times in practice, which basically says keep your weight decay explicit out here instead of somehow hidden inside your loss. Because you don't want Adam mucking around with adaptations that have to do with the weight decay. So it's like all like deep learning considerations when it comes to adaptive optimizers. I am out of time and I'm slower as usual. Okay, whatever. I'm fine. I'll make it up on Monday in time for discussion. Just next week is going to be ConNet discussion, so we'll get there. Any questions? Come up and ask. Well, I can answer briefly here. Then I'm going to have to move over to 258.
It's just elevated too.